Thank you, Nick. Yes, that simulation that took place at the then DTI in 2005 was judged by the adjudicators to be quite a success because the country suffered only slightly more casualties than during the whole of World War II. It shows that this event is not a black swan at all. It's a known unknown. Everybody who attended there knew that something like this was going to happen. They just didn't know when. And yet, we're not terribly well prepared. Now, Rebecca and I, both directors of the Ashridge Strategic Management Centre, have been working together for some time over how to make good decisions in high uncertainty. We both work for corporates, but we have slightly different emphases. I draw a great deal on my studies of military history and the approaches I take, and Rebecca's got a great deal of experience working with startups, high-growth companies, and high-tech companies. And therefore, if we put our two experience bases together, we've got quite a broad range. And I think having broad sets of models to think of in dealing with this is valuable. Now, at that simulation, I was struck by one thing in particular, which is that the people working in the government were busy trying to reassure everyone that everything was working smoothly, which it wasn't. And people in the press were busy trying to make everybody suspicious and tell them that it was all a shambles, which it wasn't either. Neither of those accounts were true. But there were people in the middle, scientists and medics, who were trying to get a grip on reality and solve the problem. And what we want to do is to see whether we in business can join them. Rebecca's going to take you through the agenda and give you some basic background. And then I will talk a bit about what's going on and how to orientate ourselves. If you think back to John Boyd's OODA loop, I'm going to do observe and orient, and Rebecca will then take over and talk about what we think are the sort of things that you can do. So decide and act in OODA loop terms. So over to you, Rebecca.
All right, great. Thank you, Stephen. And I will just say good morning as well, and very much looking forward to going through this conversation with you over the next few minutes. So there's a few things that we want to cover in the first part of the webinar. First, just kind of setting the scene of what the theme and the title was, which is Stop Planning, Start Preparing, and what we mean by that and what it takes. Then I'm going to turn it back to Stephen, who will be going through the current situation as well as the outlook. Then I will take it back and talk about something Nick briefly touched on in the onsite, which was this notion of how do we survive, reset, and thrive, and remind ourselves that downturns can be a great time to grow, and what is our role in helping the organization get to that. And then Stephen will come back and do a quick wrap up after that. But if we get started back to what we're talking about and looking at the situation that we're in, we're all facing an extreme amount of uncertainty. Now, this is, of course, on the macro side across the overall economy, our industries, our companies, and also personal. And look, uncertainty is uncomfortable, and it provides all these other emotions as well as practical things that make it very difficult to deal with. But if we take a step back, I think it is important to remember that uncertainty is a thing. It's a series of future events which may or may not occur. And whether or not those events are good or bad depends on how our organization is set up, what we're trying to achieve, and how we react. So those are the pieces we need to focus the most on: how we're set up, what we're trying to achieve, and how we react. But looking at uncertainty, why is it such a problem? For a couple of different reasons. One, because we can't know what's going to happen in the future. It makes it very difficult to make good predictions. And because uncertainty provides anxiety, it makes it very difficult to make good decisions. So the question we have as leaders is, how can we make good good decisions when we can't make good predictions? And in the real world, we see a few different things happen when company CEOs and leaders face this crisis. And I see these all the time, especially in more entrepreneurial, high-growth companies. And here are the few things I see this. The first, and we're going to start seeing this soon, is you'll have organization leaders who say, we've seen this before. This is like 0809. This is like SARS. We assume that this future event will be like a past one, and we just plow ahead. We call this delusion. The other thing that we see, and we saw this for those here in the UK right after Brexit as well, is this notion of let's just wait. Everything is so uncertain. Let's just wait and not do anything now, take any action until we know more. And the problem is we get into this constant waiting mode, almost a constant holding pattern, and circle, and we call that paralysis. And the third one, and I fear I'm going to see the most of this, is we go into panic mode. And when we're in panic mode, we just start throwing stuff at the market, and that's what leads to what I call chaos. So delusion, paralysis, chaos, neither a good outcome of what we want to see our organizations do. So what options do we have? Well, it's stop planning and start preparing. And why? Why do we say that? And what do we mean by it? The notion is planning is very useful in a stable, predictable world. And some of us lived a little bit in that. Some of us haven't been living in that in our industries for a long time, but we're still resulting on these tools. Preparing is what we need when we're facing extreme uncertainty or on the unknown. Planning works if you've got data that makes sense. If you have historical data, which likely projects future trends, we can do planning. When variables are familiar, the goals are fixed, we can set a very clear destination for what revenue and EBITDA targets we need to be at, and we're trying to optimize for efficiency. And one of the key things that we're seeing emerge out of this crisis was the number of organizations and companies who were purely optimized for efficiency. Just-in-time supply chains, low inventory, all this optimization was for efficiency, which unfortunately is being exposed. In a preparing world, and the toolkit we have to line on now, we have to make decisions based on beliefs, which we'll come back to in a few minutes. The variables are emerging and for many of them unknown. The goals are moving, and instead of having very fixed destinations, we need to move to something we call a compass heading. Think of actually Homkes, this notion of we're going northwest versus a very specific destination. And critically, we need to start optimizing our decisions and our organization for robustness. Now I'm going to come back and touch on a lot of these themes and how we use these in both the survive, reset, thrive phase. But first, I want to turn it back to Stephen, who's going to talk a little bit more about the current situation as well as our outlook for the near future. So Stephen, I'll turn the session to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. So before taking any action, it's critical to be able to orientate yourself and understand what is actually going on. We're absolutely inundated with information at the moment. So what I try to do is to pull something together based on what I regard as reasonably reliable sources. The basic fact is that this virus is actually a mild illness for the many, but a deadly threat to the few. And that poses a tension, in fact, in the reactions, which is going to be highlighted over the coming weeks. So far, we've been able to discern four main patterns of reaction. The first one was carried out in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, and it involves immediate test and trace. That so far seems to be the most successful. The idea is to contain the infection. There have only been a few deaths, and there's very low social and economic cost. The second one, if you're not able to do the first, was what the Chinese did, and I call that rapid lockdown. That contains the infection. There are some deaths, and there's a high but bearable social and economic cost. China is just coming out of it now. The third one is to delay reaction, and that's where we are at the moment. That's most of Europe and the US, and we waited before introducing the lockdown. That is the worst of all possible worlds because you give the virus time to spread amongst a large number of the population. This is a hope, and we're going to see how that plays out over the next few weeks, to cap the very high levels of deaths as the hospital's number of ICUs is unable to cope with the number of cases needing treatment, and the social and economic cost is extremely high. There is a fourth one. The UK was heading in this direction, but then on the publication of that paper from Imperial College on the 23rd of March, moved away to option 3. It's currently being pursued by Sweden. There are restrictions on people which are largely taken voluntarily. They shield the high-risk groups, but basically the economy and social life continue to run. And currently they're experiencing a low death rate, There's not exponential growth, there's linear growth at low social and economic cost. We don't know how that's going to play out. Rest on certain assumptions, but watch them because they're an interesting outlier. Controversial even within Sweden, but interesting. Now, one of the big questions is where does that lead us, and what sort of time frame are we looking at? So, if we look at the implications, this is the purpose of the lockdown strategy. It's to flatten the curve. So the number of serious cases is spread over time, but reduced in peak so that the hospital system can cope. However, the delay that we've suffered, and we've introduced this a full 2 weeks after China, means that the curve will in any case be too steep for the ICU capacity to cope. We can't do anything about the number of cases now. We don't know how many there are. The first thing that lockdown is going to tell us is how big a hole we have dug ourselves into in the meantime. But when you're dealing with exponential growth, 2 weeks will mean that you're going to be dealing with a very high number. So the curve is going to be steep. The only way we can close that gap now is through exponential growth in ICU capacity. That is what is being attempted at. So lockdown just buys time. How long could it last? Well, people are infectious, as far as we know, for up to 20 days before they become symptomatic, and up to a maximum of 31, though the average is around 20 thereafter. Gives a total of 51 days. That implies that if lockdown is going to be rigorously enforced, it's going to have to last 8 weeks, which is what China's doing. However, under the delayed reaction, lockdown may have to last longer. The British authorities talk about 13 weeks. But the problem is that you've now got a goal conflict. So, in looking at the way in which we can get out of this, if we move on to the next slide, the minimum lockdown to allow capacity growth in ICUs is 3 or 4 weeks. If you optimize the medical goal of minimizing deaths, you probably need to be 13 to 14 weeks. But the social and economic cost will then be very high indeed. Whereas reaction 1 in Southeast Asia killed the 2 birds with 1 stone, low deaths, little disruption, we've got a choice between high deaths and high disruption, and may end up getting both. So we're in a bind, and we've got to get out of it. Probably what's going to happen is that the supply chains become strained. We will relax lockdown, and if people are getting into a situation where they can't actually access food or can't afford to buy it because their incomes have dried up, there's going to be social unrest, and that will put pressure on politicians as well. The way to do that and avoid further outbreaks is mass testing and tracing of the kind that was done in Southeast Asia from the first, and the government systems are dealing with that now. They're struggling at the moment because there aren't enough test kits available. But the idea is to move from a blanket strategy where everybody gets paid to a focused strategy where you just isolate the high-risk groups. You know who the carriers are, so you can isolate them and life will return to normal. Therefore, probably the minimum time for lockdown is now 4 weeks. The maximum is probably something of the order of 12 to 13. It's likely to last for something in between those. Nobody knows how long, but what you can do in trying to prepare yourselves is to try to put some boundaries on the plausible limits rather than trying to predict how long it's actually going to be. We'll find out in the course of the next few weeks. With that, then, the question is, what do you do? Given that that's the context. And Rebecca's going to take you through a few steps that we have put in various papers that we've written to our clients.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Stephen. So going back now, so what do you do? So Stephen has outlined the situation as well as the outlook. And I know that I'm having multiple conversations a day, as I'm sure Stephen is, and I'm sure many of you with your own CEOs. With CEOs are leaders who are concerned they're anxious, they're uncertain. They know that when we do get out of the immediacy of the crisis, there's going to be a recession, and they're worried about what that means for their organization. So the framework I'm asking people to think about is what you see on the slide in front of you there. Survive, reset, thrive. And it's a three-step process. It's a three-step process to understand how to stabilize through the current crisis, reset your strategy and plans, and then thrive. Now, let me start with something that I'm going to come back and end with. Downturns can be a great time to grow. And I know that almost sounds silly, but I'm going to say it again. Downturns can be a great time to grow. Everybody can grow a company and have a successful organization when everything's going up. But sometimes it's when a bit of the froth comes out, that those only with that true strategic insight prevail. And that's what we want you to get your company to start thinking about. But right now, most of us are in survive mode, and that's understandable. And I'm going to talk through what we need to do in that mode, but make sure we're already thinking now about the next two stages. So what does the survive or the stabilized mode mean? Now, the famed investor Warren Buffett has a lovely quote that's being used a lot right now. And he says, rule number one is stay in business. Rule number two, don't forget rule number one. And that's a lot of what we're trying to go through right now. So what do you need to do in the survive phase? Now, there's many operational basics that you need to get right. The principles of thriving through a recession are about a low fixed cost base. So you want costs that don't rise, so you want your actual fixed cost base, which is the cost you have to pay no matter what else happens, to be as low as possible. You want your cash to last as long as possible. In California, in the investing world, we recommend companies have 36-month cash flow on hand at all times. Bill Gates has a similar principle where he says all companies should have enough cash to pay all of your employees for 12 months and a strong balance sheet. All of these things are an absolute necessity in the survive phase. But there's other things you need to do, and I'm not seeing as much of this happen. The next notion is what I call repurposing and partnering. So assuming you got the basics right and you don't need to do mass layoffs, which we can come back to in a minute, then we need to look at your organization. What are areas of the business or teams who are not working at full capacity now? Retail workers, salespeople who did direct sales, those types of things. How can they be repurposed across the organization and deployed to other areas? If your organization has a large amount of workers that cannot be utilized right now, how can we repurpose them to another organization? Some of the fast fashion companies here in the UK, for instance, have repurposed their employees to Tesco. They're saying, look, we've got all the employees, we vetted them, let's give them to another organization who needs them right now. So repurpose and partner should be the next step we go to. Some organizations, of course, have to repurpose or partner for national good. I'm sure many of you have seen the news, but the Formula One teams are now using their production facilities to make ventilators. We're seeing stories all around the world, from LVMH in France making hand sanitizer to even Tito's Vodka in the US also making hand sanitizer. The next piece I know is one very close to many of you, and it's the notion of employee engagement. Now, this is always important, but right now it is strategic. And it's not the engagement and then the old kind of Gallup ways. What I mean is what I call the pulse. How are people doing? Are they able to be productive at home? Do they have the equipment they need at home, the space they need at home? Companies that are having a lot of success in the US right now just made a budget for employees to have the extra monitors, the speakers, the headsets they need at home, to just say, we don't want people coming into the office or uncomfortable on a day-to-day basis because they can't work. So can we make sure that employees are that? If you are an HRD, I recommend getting a 15-minute slot, very short, either every day or every couple of days, to give your CEO an update on the employee pulse and escalate any issues he or she needs to deal with. But just make sure you've got your finger constantly on that. Then the fourth point matters. One of the key distinguishments of a high growth organization is learning velocity. Companies that learn faster grow faster. The principle is that simple. Companies that learn faster grow faster. Many companies in survive forget learning, and they just focus on survive. Those that get to thrive are focused very much on learning, testing assumptions, cross-departmental learning, learning from other organizations, making sure even if they can't do formal L&D programs right now, they're still helping the organization learn as quickly and efficiently as possible. And finally, something I know many of you have also been in, you have to make the tough choices. Something we say a lot is you can't always protect jobs, but you can protect people. And I remind CEOs and leaders a lot that the how you make and execute on these choices right now is sometimes just as important as what the choices are. Organizational values come out in times like this. If your company claims to have values of fairness or trust or authenticity or all of these other things, and you're not showing them now, those values don't exist. So making sure that we're protecting people, and that's not just our employees, our vendors and our customers as well. So a few principles on the survive phase. But next we need to go into reset. And reset means you went into March 2020 with a strategy. There's a pretty good chance that strategy is no longer valid. Let's acknowledge that and prepare to reset it. And there's a couple pieces of the strategy we have to reset. The first is a situation assessment. Next, our definition of success. Third, your organization's competitive advantage. And fourth, your actual priorities. I'm going to touch on these pieces very quickly. So the first one is your situation assessment. And a big mistake that I see happen all of the time in board meetings or exco meetings when we're reviewing the strategy is we sit at the boardroom table and somebody says, are we on track to plan? And they like to open that review meeting with the question, are we on track to plan? This is actually the wrong question to open a review meeting with. You open a review meeting with the question, has the situation changed? Because if the situation's changed, being on track to plan might be a bad thing. But more importantly, we care about what should we be doing now. So let me be very clear, the situation has changed for all of us, every industry, every sector, every company. So we need to go back to that situation assessment and say, what matters now? Now, this is not trying to predict the future because you can't predict the future. None of us can. What high growth organizations do is identify, clarify, and articulate their key organizational beliefs. What do we believe to be true? Again, it's not predicting, but we can't wait for facts. The future is too uncertain. All we can do is set our beliefs. So a belief sets things as far as what are the overall changes we expect to happen? There's an extreme view right now that people will embrace virtual working and will never have live meetings again. There's another extreme view that the second we're allowed to change these things, we're all going to rush back and want to meet with humans again. There's a belief people will rush back to restaurants and live events and sports, and others that will stay away. And then as far as how industries change, people consume, all of these things that shape your industry, as an executive team, we need to start sitting down and saying, what do we believe to be true? I call it a stance. What's our best stance and how things are going to come out? These work if they're what's on the left side of the screen, testable hypotheses that guide action, not things on the right. So first, reset your beliefs. Second, what are we trying to achieve? What's our definition of success? Now, many organizations have what we call a destination, a very clear endpoint. Your organization has a revenue target, a profit target, maybe a cash target, all of these very clear things that say, we need to look like this. That's a destination. If we're traveling down the road, think of something like exit 405 for Santa Monica. Now, destinations work if you're a public company with clear shareholder expectations or an exit is coming soon, but they don't work in other situations. They don't work when there's a massive business model shift or when we're facing extreme uncertainty, which we are right now. What you need for that instead is what's called a direction, or think of holding a compass and setting a direction on it, like as going northwest. And if you remember the exploration in the US in the 1800s, the notion was not go to Santa Monica. It was go west, young man, go west. If they had headed for Santa Monica, they would have missed the gold. So what we're suggesting is destinations need to shift to directions. Instead of giving the organization very clear numerical targets right now, we just need a direction. Why is that? Because we don't want to head straight for the wrong destination, but we still need some alignment and making sure we're all headed in the same direction. What does that look like? A very clear intent. Here's what we're trying to achieve and why, within tight boundaries. Now, boundaries, think of it like a fence or parameters, like my hand's drawing around there right now. And this is the real trick to growing quickly through uncertainty. Instead of managing by activities, telling people what to do, micromanagement is not effective in good times. It's not effective or scalable right now, especially. Organizations that do very well set a clear intent. Here's what we're trying to achieve. and then give the organization boundaries or parameters. And then we have to let the organization execute towards that intent within those boundaries. Let me give you a simple example of this. So for those of you who have young kids, I want you to think about going outside and playing with your kids in the park or your yard, or back when we were allowed to all play outside in the park together. You know, most of us don't go outside with our kids and say something like, from 8 to 8:15, kick the ball. From 8:15 to 8:30, swing. From 8:30 to 8:45, play tag. I mean, most of us don't talk to our children like this, right? Instead, we'd say something like, I want you to go outside and have fun and make a new friend, but don't leave the park and be home by lunchtime, giving them a clear intent within some boundaries, and stepping back as parents and letting them execute towards that intent within those boundaries. And we need to do the same thing for organizations. Instead of these very specific activities, which might be leading them to the wrong destination, instead think about intent within boundaries. Now, as far as the cadence, I prefer switching to commitments rather than KPIs right now. Reason being, your KPIs, your OKRs, the numbers are probably wrong, but we still want to keep some rhythm. So think about going to a notion of weekly commitments. Here's what I said I'd do. Here's what I did. Here's what's working. Here's what's not working. Here's the help that I need. And meeting even more frequently than you used to. But instead of checking back and managing to people to metrics, manage them to whether or not they met their commitments. The next thing I'll quickly touch on is this notion of competitive advantage. A reset fundamentally comes back to saying, for our organization, let's go back there, what is our real competitive advantage? What do we have that other organizations don't? What can we do that other organizations can't? And that's really where advantage comes from. Having things others don't, doing things others can't, and making sure the advantage we had coming into March 2020 will be the advantage that will take us out of it. And there might be some things your organization has now that are actually hugely beneficial going forward, like access to distribution channels, the ability to scale up or scale down quickly, a large pile of cash, making sure we know here's what our competitive advantage is. And then finally, what are we trying to achieve? Look back at your main strategic priorities. Now more than ever, we need to make sure there's very few of them. We can't manage a long list right now, and they're very clear. Now is not a time for balanced scorecards or kind of generic pillars, kind of making sure everything gets covered. Growth is fundamentally unbalanced. Some things matter more than other things at different points in time. Now is the time to be very critical and make sure we take some things off the table so we can focus just on those things we are able to win on. If your organization doesn't have a strategic priority on operational efficiency, they need to add one. Every organization needs to make operational efficiency a key strategic target. That doesn't mean cutting 20% across the board. Whenever I see that, that reveals an organization that doesn't have strategic insight. What I'm saying is really knowing your competitive advantage, which I just touched on, making sure that's protected, and everywhere else we go to the most cost competitive cost base. So that's our reset. And then finally, let's talk about the exciting part, which is thrive. Now I'm saying these in 3 phases, but getting to thrive means we're already thinking about it right now on April 2nd. Organizations that are going to thrive are already thinking about it. And I'm having these conversations with CEOs who are talking about the opportunities they're seeing, how they're going to come out of this, how they need to size the organization and scale it up, and what capabilities they need to put in place now so they can do that. Now, a lot of thrive comes back to your reset. So I won't speak specifically here, but a few general principles. Those beliefs that I mentioned, we have to start testing them. Beliefs are testable. So it's calling out our stance and saying, how will we know if this is true? What can we test? Going back to your competitive advantage, how is that going to take us out of this? The other notion is automation. The principle I'd like you to remember is what can be digitized should be. If your organization was behind on the digital pathway, it has to ramp up now. Those are going to be the only organizations that get through the thrive are those who are more digitized and more automated. And find the strategic insight. Imbalances in supply and demand, we don't have this coming in. And that's why this crisis is so bad, because we have both of them off. Demand to buy goods and services and solutions, and the supply of those goods, services, and solutions. They're both a bit off. But any sort of shock or crisis always creates imbalances in these things. How can your organization meet them and exploit the strategic advantage? In doing this, Thrive organizations have what I call discipline flexibility. And that's the real key to this whole thing. And I know you're thinking, well, discipline means being very methodical and flexibility means being very adaptable. How can you do them both? Well, that's why it's a trick. Organizations who grow out of uncertainty have this. It's a very methodical, analytical approach. Again, weekly commitments, constant testing, articulating assumptions, but they're giving people the flexibility and adaptability to seize and grab opportunities aligned with that strategy. And that's a real thing we need to do. And how does that actually look like? Well, the principle I want you to remember is you manage to outcomes, not activities. Instead of managing activities and what people do every day, we're just managing to outcomes, what they achieve. And that gives people that flexibility to adapt and seize opportunities as they come up. So through survive, reset, thrive. Now, I won't go through these points. I'm just calling out in the slide deck. I've got a slide that summarizes a lot of these basics together onto one. But your leadership team is going to have to drive the organization through these three phases. I'm going to turn it back to Stephen now to talk about what does this take from our EXCO, our leadership team, to bring an organization through the downturn to growth afterwards. So Stephen, over to you to speak about the Trinity.
Thanks, Rebecca. You will all be familiar with the distinction between managing and leading. Managing is about organizing, controlling resources. Leading is fundamentally about motivating people. The unfamiliar circle up there will be directing. And I realized some time ago when studying the behavior of the great commanders in history that this was actually a critical thing that we were leaving out and somehow lumping into leadership in business, but it's actually very different. Directing is, as it suggests, about setting direction, about making decisions, about strategy and where you end up. What tends to happen in a crisis is that leadership comes to the fore, quite rightly. You need to motivate people, and management becomes critical, resource allocation. Everybody's been doing an awful lot of that. The trouble is that if everybody's doing that and nobody is doing any directing, you may get through survive, but you won't reset and thrive in the end. And Warren Buffett didn't just mean stay in business now, he meant stay in business tomorrow and the day after as well. What I see happening is that senior leaders are dragged down into operations and spend all their time managing and leading, but don't step back. What they do, in fact, is to do the job at the level below. This leads to duplication of effort. It can create confusion, and most dangerously, it leaves a gap in that top circle. The result of that will be that the organization will lurch from crisis to crisis. What you need to do, therefore, is to make sure that your top team, EXCO, whoever they are actually stepping back periodically and thinking about the overall direction of the kind that Becca explained. It would be helpful for them if they had an expert team doing the orientation and updating of orientation and acting as an advisor to them. They don't want to try and do that themselves. Otherwise, they will just say, well, I read the paper yesterday and it will be garbage. You need a small group of people who can actually develop a certain amount of expertise in this area and are constantly updating themselves, updating things, checking sources for accuracy, and being sort of staff group or maybe a task force which is advising EXCO. And the best way to organize that is according to Crystal's team of teams, where they don't all report in to EXCO, but they network with each other with some overlapping membership. You can read that up on the internet. We don't need to go into how to do that now. I hope most of you have already done that. But you do need to try to discipline the top people so that they do not get out of a long screwdriver and step back and think hard about the big questions. There are techniques, of course, that you can use for that. Look up how scenario planning is done. That's basically a matter of deciding on what the key variables are. So is this crisis going to be long or short? the economy going to end up just getting by, or is there going to be collapse? And thinking about the extremes, putting dimensions into a matrix, thinking about extremes, and importantly, positioning yourselves so that you'll do okay under any plausible future, and ideally are seeing a kicker under one of the scenarios. But scenario planning is not designed to predict, it's designed to prepare your mind. The worst thing you can do is to say, well, of these 4 scenarios, I think it's number 2 that's going to come out, and we're going to optimize for that. That is optimizing for efficiency. You need to optimize for robustness, which means you're okay under any given set of scenarios. And having mentioned scenarios, perhaps it'll be nice to wind up with a famous statement that originates from Pierre Wack, one of the Shell executives who actually was at the heart of developing scenario planning. If it rains in the hills, it will flood in the plains. What we tend to do in a crisis is to see everything changing, and we think that there is no way of orientating ourselves at all. But of course, if you see the rain coming down, what you can predict is that there will be flooding on lower ground. You cannot predict when, you cannot quite predict its severity, but some things that you can do now are to define the variables. So where is the rain falling in your business and how heavy is it? Where do you have low ground where you could be vulnerable? And where could you do something now? Should you be building flood defenses, or should you be evacuating some of the villages and shifting away from those areas? You be able to think of equivalents within your business. And some of the rain may do some good. So a couple of my clients are actually who acted early on getting people to work from home, a week to 10 days before lockdown was declared in the UK on the 23rd of March, are looking at the chaos amongst their competitors, realizing there's going to be consolidation, are putting together a war chest because there are going to be a lot of distressed companies available at knockdown prices. So they're getting ready for an M&A bonanza. They're setting up little groups to gain some expertise in PMI, and they're doing that now. So you need a few people in that directing mode who are not just dealing with the shit that's just hit the fan, but thinking beyond that to how things can play out and preparing the organization to deal with that. It's not a plan, it's setting out the parameters, it's understanding the kind of space you're going to be operating in and getting things ready for whatever happens afterwards. That's the way you get out of crisis management and thrive. So overall, for you guys, here are some things that we just want to stress before handing over to Nick to deal with questions. Set aside time for preparation. It's probably more than just an hour a week. People need to get together for several hours to really start thinking things through. What's going to matter is not so much the quality of the data, which is going to be changing all the time, but the quality of the thinking and the flexibility of the thinking. The situation is extremely ambiguous. Scientists are disagreeing with each other. An imperial paper comes out, and then a little bit later, Oxford University published another one that seems to be going in the other direction. That's the way science works. People have debates. They're trying to get their minds around reality. And when it's ambiguous, there's more than one opinion. That will probably gradually be resolved. But that's the way you need to act now. You need to act in the way in which scientists act. But don't take any single statement of scientists being true. You need to keep the pulse on employees' emotions. Uncertainty produces anxiety. One of the greatest causes of stress is not feeling in control. And we're all out of control. The moment the virus is in control, we're struggling as a species pretty much to gain control. See to what extent you can give people control within the organization. In my experience, the absolute bedrock of morale is knowing that you are making a meaningful contribution to a collective effort, connecting people to the company's purpose, so that the decisions being made about what really matters now, what the intent is critical to that. Bite the bullet now on people, especially ones you've been pulling off, and prepare a team that can review and reset the strategy with building your own experts inside thinking through scenarios. Set some regularity of setting and meeting commitments. You need a review meeting. Remember, the critical question is not, are we on track? There is no track to be on at the moment. The critical question is, has the situation changed, and therefore do we need to do something differently? Divide up different layers, people who are dealing with tactics, dealing with operations, and people at the top who are doing strategy. Make sure they're thinking broadly and setting direction clearly. And within HR, don't try and develop a strategy of your own. What you need to do is to understand the business strategy. It's the business that needs the strategy, and understand how you support it. There may be big changes in the structure of the workforce. You need to do some workforce planning. Have you got a good succession plan in place? You may need that earlier than you thought. There's some of that nitty-gritty stuff of thinking beyond the obvious where HR can actually add some value. Final message then, just to emphasize it again. Don't try to predict the end state. Try to understand what is happening now and keep on interrogating your understanding. Don't fret about what you can't control. That just causes stress, wastes time, and resources. Make some robust decisions about what you can control. There's plenty to do, and we can get through it. So that's what we had to say in a nutshell. Nick, are there questions?
Nick, I believe you're muted if you're speaking.
Unmute yourself, Nick. You're still muted.
Thank you, Rebecca.
There we are.
Muted now. Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for that. That was really challenging. It's really made me think. We're opening up. If there are any questions coming into the chat room, please share them. But in the meantime, I had a question. I had an interesting session yesterday where we had a webinar where we got a number of heads of L&D from our members, where it wasn't a presentation, it was an opportunity to share. And one of them, interestingly, talked about him repositioning his role from running training programs to becoming a personal coach and confidant to senior leaders in his organization. What I picked up from this, it's a real issue about mindset, where, for instance, Rebecca, you talked about optimizing for efficiency as a mindset which isn't going to be relevant anymore. But of course, it's become the way of doing things and an accepted mindset. How can HR help leaders change mindsets when, as I say, their whole training, their whole experience, the reason for their success has been based on a very different mindset?
Yeah, let me say something quickly and then I'll turn it back to Stephen. The language of beliefs and assumptions is what I use, and I think that's what distinguishes very successful high growth companies and CEOs from those that aren't, is they acknowledge when they have a belief that they need to test, and therefore what assumptions are. So I think kind of when I'm in conversations, it's calling things back like, but that's a belief, right? But what do we believe? That sounds like an assumption. And really in the conversation, helping them lay out what do we know versus what we don't know. And right now, what we don't know is a lot, but we can start thinking about our beliefs. The other thing I would think about as far as your role of being a confidant is don't spend time on the when, spend time on the how. Spending time predicting when we'll come out of this or when things will go back, all of these conversations are completely out of any human being's hands, right? So as an organization, we need to start thinking about the how. How will this look? How many of our suppliers will still be around? How will our workforce shift back? And so spending time on the how along with the beliefs and assumptions. And that's a very powerful role. And also holding to account, right? If you do want to take this role, then this needs to be part of kind of just as the rhythm as normal. So putting a weekly call on, putting a weekly meeting on via Zoom to say, look, if we're serious about kind of this reset and going into the thrive, this needs to be part of the way that we work now, not just an ad hoc when they've got the opportunity. Setting homework, just like you would leading some other meetings. Here's 3 questions I think we need to explore next week. Let's come back to those. So being an advisor is just as much about being an accountability partner.
Yeah, I've got a mixture of people in those positions. Some of them are handling very well. They are people who are comfortable with ambiguity and also relaxed when facing uncertainty, because they know they can cope with it. What they are not relaxed about is feeling confused. These are people who know how to think through those broad parameters and set a clear direction when they are when the data isn't giving you the answer. There are a lot of people who expect someone to be able to produce the answer off an Excel spreadsheet, and that obviates the need to take decisions. So these people are also good decision makers. And I think that shift from sort of general leadership development into coaching individuals is one that is likely to be more widespread, and I think that certainly is where you can add value. Some of the HRDs I've known who've been most effective have been able to build really strong, actually pretty intimate relationships with senior people, FDs and CEOs and so on, and point out to them where they're making mistakes. Because this business of being a good director is something that has to be learned. There are some people who find it easier to achieve than others, but it's pretty damn difficult, and it's a rare skill to find it mastered. And people actually teach themselves. I think if I point you in the direction of someone who's very good at that, it's the investor Terry Smith. I know Terry quite well. He's the most, he runs Fundsmith, which is the best performing fund in the UK and has been for about 5 years. And I'm struck very much about him. He's a very self-confident chap, and he's very comfortable telling you what he doesn't know. And he talks about having emotional discipline. He's sort of trained himself not to speculate about what's going to happen, but to make sure that he follows sound principles, which mean that, whatever does happen, he's going to come out of it pretty well. He keeps on posting. He wrote something recently that was circulated to investors in Fundsmith. I think you'll probably find it in the open. He's a sort of British equivalent of Warren Buffett in many ways. I think those two guys are good models for the way in which you think, and you can school people away from realizing that their past habits are now not just suboptimal, but deeply dysfunctional, and now is an opportunity to adopt a different approach, because they're not going to be blamed anymore for saying, we really don't know, because nobody does. And saying that you do just makes you sound like a fool.
Stephen, I'm actually going to come in so we can get to some of the other questions, if that's okay. So I'll take Emma, I'll take yours first, and then Sean, I'll hand yours to Stephen. So Emma said, some of our leaders are doing something similar, based very much on the operational tasks, and kind of we feel like we're spinning our wheels. Like, any suggestions? Emma, I found just laying out the notion of survive, reset, thrive, and talking through your leaders about how much are we spending on these 3 different pieces right now, and how much do you think is the appropriate time? And I'm not being overly simplistic, but I found that actually just saying those 3 words, I can't tell you how many conversations where people just acknowledge they're spending their time in the survive mode, but there is another side to this. So I think just laying out those pieces and talking about, are we doing what we need to do to survive? Let's assign one person to keep his or her full focus on that. So therefore we can start freeing up some of our leaders to go to reset and thrive, and ask them to think about their kind of ideal time percentage over a week across those 3. And again, and the challenging question is, if we want to be a thrive organization, we've got to start now, right? And that is the real challenge of thrive, is you don't get to thrive many months down the road. You start thinking about what that looks like now. So Sean asked a question. Sean, Stephen says, as a military historian, any lessons or parallels from the past? And you've got about 2 minutes.
Yeah, all right. I noticed the war metaphor has been raised by all sorts of leaders. My heart sinks when I hear that, because I know it's going to be a prelude to false heroics and pretending to be macho, and they don't really understand what war is like. However, yeah, there are some fundamental lessons. I mean, war is nothing other than a set of interlocking crises. I drew that idea of the Trinity from the way in which the great commanders handled themselves. I don't want to go into detail as to how one can see all this here, but essentially the successful countries have had a very focused, information-led response, and those who are floundering have been caught on the back foot. The virus has got the initiative, and they're engaged in what you might call is the equivalent of French warfare. We know full well that they've got to break out of that, and it's going to be costly. But those particular birds have flown. I think I'm struck by how people who are able to survive and thrive in warfare are usually not those who are there at the beginning, who like to control everything. They fall by the wayside pretty quickly. Successful generals are able to deal with ambiguity, and they start thinking ahead very quickly. Montgomery once said that his job was to think about not the current battle that's being fought, but the one after that and where it leads to ultimately. And somebody needs to be doing that now. That's how armies are able to be successful and the tests of warfare, some of which are the kinds of stress that we're all starting to face now.
And Stephen, I think that's a good segue, actually, the notion of thinking about the next battle to the question that Richard asked. So Richard, you said we need to start building a team to thinking about the future. Who should be on that and the role of HR? Great question. The answer, of course, is it depends, as most questions are along this lines. But definitely your CEO, that's his main role. Head of strategy, head of innovation. Your head of operations should probably be focused mostly on the survive with occasional input into this team. And then HR should absolutely be on this. The reason being many people in Thrive are going to look different. The workforce will need different skills, capabilities, and talents, and they might be working and living in different ways. So I think the HR person should be on this more as an advisor necessarily than a decision maker, so you can start thinking ahead to these things as well. So excellent question. And then one more, I think, Daniel, you said, what should we do with folks who aren't clear on purpose, belief, strategy, and we're playing catch up? Well, Daniel, I'd say now's a pretty good time to start, right? And I'm not making a joke. If you don't have it, like, that's okay. Everyone else is resetting anyway. Just get on it. Go through those critical questions about where we want to play, how we want to win, and what success looks like for us now, and really start thinking about those beliefs. It's not too late to get started if you think you didn't have a clear strategy, especially because everybody else is resetting as we speak, or does need to reset if they want to get to Thrive. So Nick, I just took care of the ones I see in the chat, but maybe I'll hand it back to you.
I think we're actually coming up for time now, so let's put it all to a close. We'll be putting the notes and the slides online. Thank you, Rebecca. I was just going to mention the last slide that if you have additional questions for Rebecca or for Stephen, please feel free. I just had a last thought myself that as well as thinking about survive, reset and thrive for the business, I think we also need to think about this for HR as a function. You know, clearly we have a critical role in addressing the people issues in the short term, whether that's around furlough or connecting people, and we need to step up and play that role. But I think there's a real challenge for us as HR and as HR leaders to think about the reset button, as you've both said, to really step into the space and facilitate and challenge and make sure that there isn't just the focus on the operational, and also to prepare for Thrive. What capabilities, what new skills will we require? And Stephen, my biggest single takeaway was your point about, for some organizations, this is going to be an M&A bonanza. It always comes back.
That is one of the things that's coming out, and I know two who are licking their lips actually as things go. And are looking towards the end of the year. They've already got people on it. They're already organising for Thrive. Perhaps at the final word, I might point out that some of the writing on which this talk was based and as summarised is available on my website at that address there, StephenBungay.com. There's a section in there called Random Thoughts. There are 3 papers that have been uploaded onto it if you want to sort of go through some of this again in a rather more relaxed way and follow up. And Rebecca and I will be happy to hear from anyone.
Yeah, similar for Survive, Reset, and Thrive. Just feel free to get in touch if you'd like a more lengthy explanation.
Thank you to you both. And I did some research in 2009. I remember the HR director of a large IT company, and it's my last thought is never waste a good crisis.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody. And again, Rebecca and Stephen, thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant.